March 30th, 2014. It's a Saturday afternoon in Gwinnett County, Georgia, a suburb just 30 miles outside the heart of Atlanta.
People from all over the world come here who are seeking work or employment in and around the Atlanta area.
There's several colleges, there's industry, technology going on here.
For most, today is a day of respite. But for Celia Owens, her weekend has been anything but relaxing.
On Friday evening, Celia agreed to watch the 3-year-old daughter of her friend, Angela Rabate, while Angela was at work.
But Angela never returned to pick up her daughter.
And listen, I'm starting to get really worried. Please, call me back.
She hadn't heard from her, and all of Celia's calls were going straight to voicemail.
Celia starts reaching out to Angela's mother, who lives in Las Vegas.
Hello?
Hi, Judy.
Oh, hi, Celia. What's up?
I don't want to sound overdramatic, but I'm really concerned about Angela.
When Celia called me and told me that Angie had not been there to pick up Shay, there was reason to be concerned because she would not have left her daughter without it being known that she wasn't coming back that night. It was so out of the ordinary for her to do that. So it immediately raised red flags.
I need you to go to the police, okay?
I'm going to get the next flight out, and I'll call you as soon as I land, all right?
Something was really wrong. Like something was wrong.
Known for her beauty and spirited personality, 26-year-old Angela Rabate had the charm and fire to take the world head on.
Angie just was always full of life. She was smiles galore, active, energetic, fun-loving, just wanted to be the life of the party.
Angela was a ball of everything. Like, she was funny. Like, that's what kind of gravitated me towards her. She was always joking. Just a fun person to be around.
Angela's good looks and magnetic personality landed her several modeling gigs throughout her 20s.
People gravitated towards Angela. So, like, she did a couple of modeling gigs. She did a lot of print model for magazines. She was very, very photogenic, you know? So, yeah, she definitely wanted to pursue a career in modeling.
She hoped a career in modeling would allow her to travel the world.
She just wanted to have fun and enjoy life. She just wanted to see everything. She loved going to Miami. She loved going to New York. She just wanted to travel.
But more than anything else, Angela's greatest love in life was her daughter.
She's an amazing mom. She showered her with love and wanted her daughter to, you know, have the best upbringing.
She wanted the world for her daughter. Everything was about baby Shay.
However, as much as Angela hoped for a traditional family unit, her relationship with Shay's father wasn't working out.
When I met Angie, she was with her daughter's father, Brian Dunn, and they were kind of like in a rocky spot. I think he didn't like her line of work.
Eventually, they decided to part ways, but they remained in close contact for the sake of their daughter.
When Angela and Brian broke up, it was messy at first. She was really hurt by it because she didn't want to be a single parent and she didn't want to not be with him because she actually loved him. And it took a lot of them, you know, talking and getting past the anger for them to be on a better understanding.
As Angela was trying to move on from the heartbreak, she was met with a blast from the past.
In February 2014, someone she knew from back in the day walked back in her life. That was 29-year-old Charles Outlaw.
They grew up very close as teenagers, but as they grew up as adults, they lost touch.
Charles and Angela found each other on social media and reconnected.
Wow. Where you been, girl?
Oh my God, it's just been so long.
It was almost like no time had passed at all, and they picked right back up where they left off.
Come get a drink with me tonight.
Tonight?
Yeah.
Angie was a beautiful young lady. It was easy to have a crush on her. She was stunning. And she used to tell me, Mom, remember, he always had a crush on me. He still really likes me.
Even though Angela wasn't ready for another relationship, she still enjoyed Charles' company.
Angie did not have a car at the time, so Charles would take her, go get her nails done, go get her hair done.
She sent me a picture of some shoes that he had bought Shay without her even asking him to do it. So, like, he would do those little things that kind of win her over.
Angela looked at him as somebody she could really depend on, and she was really grateful for that.
But 1 month later, Angela Rabate has disappeared into thin air.
She hasn't returned to pick up her daughter after leaving her with a friend.
It immediately raised red flags.
Something was really wrong.
As Angela's mother catches the next flight from Las Vegas, Angela's friend Celia heads to the Gwinnett County Police Department to report her missing.
So when's the last time you heard from her?
Not since Friday night when she dropped off her daughter. It was around 11 p.m.
Where was she going?
She was working an event.
Celia doesn't have many details, but she does know the venue was a ritzy home in Smyrna, about 10 miles outside of Atlanta.
Celia says Angela was working the party as an exotic dancer.
Angela had recently picked up dancing as a way to provide for her daughter.
She would make hundreds, in fact thousands, in one night. She performed under the stage name Climax and made a name for herself.
Any job where you're working at night in the city in the entertainment industry can be extremely dangerous.
She was getting so much attention because of her beauty and her skill set that she started carrying a gun for protection.
Being a dancer in Atlanta, you're constantly coming into contact with people who are out and about for nefarious reasons.
Did her profession put her in danger that night?
In March of 2014, 26-year-old Angela Rabate was reconnecting with old friends after weathering a difficult breakup with the father of her daughter.
Angela began spending a lot of time with an old friend from high school named Charles Outlaw.
They started hanging, not tight, but he still was trying to kind of get into the mix. He liked her.
Angela had also picked up a lucrative career as a dancer to help provide for her daughter.
She was working as an exotic dancer, and she was damn good at it.
She would dance at high-end events around Atlanta. One night could net her thousands of dollars.
But now Angela has mysteriously disappeared after going to work at one of those high-end events.
Detectives start to wonder if maybe one of her adoring fans could have gone too far and maybe assaulted Angela or kidnapped her even.
She always has her handgun on her when she's working. She knows how sketchy some guys are out there.
Do you know any of the other girls she works with?
I know Coco. I can give you her number.
That would be helpful. Here. Just write it down there for us.
After wrapping up their interview with Celia, investigators get in touch with Angela's coworker, Coco Shaw.
I spoke with Coco Shaw over the phone, who told me that she had been at the party with Angela that night.
So it kind of just go over for me what all happened that night that you know of.
Like from the beginning, or?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, we were booked for a party Friday. We went there when we started the party and everything. It pretty much went good.
Coco says by the end of the night, Angela was starting to lose steam.
The group continued to party, but Coco tells detectives that Angela had a few drinks and needed to lay down.
Hey, hon. You doing all right? Yeah, I'm just exhausted. It's been a long night.
I asked her did she need a ride home, but she said she lived in Gwinnett, and she said that some guy was coming from Gwinnett to come get her.
Coco Shaw told me that Angela was in a good mood, that she was laughing, that she was talking to the person on the phone and giving him directions.
Around 5:30 a.m., Angela's ride arrived.
You see her. I'm headed out. All right, girl. Hey, don't forget this. Of course not.
Coco tells investigators that when Angela left that night, she had a lot of cash on her, roughly about $2,000. And she also had a money counter.
That money counter, she took it with her everywhere because she, in her line of work, she wanted to make sure she had her money.
She was acting normal. She was like happy. She was just ready to go home. She was tired.
See ya. Bye.
If anyone knows where Angela is, investigators are betting it's her mystery driver. But who is he?
Angela's friend says his name is Charles Outlaw. Detectives want to speak with Charles immediately.
Investigators quickly track down Charles Outlaw for questioning.
Thanks for coming in on such short notice, Charles. We wanted to talk to you about a missing persons case we're working on.
They inform him that Angela is missing, and by all accounts, he was the last person seen with her.
Oh my God. I hope she's all right.
You don't know where she is right now?
No.
He gave a version of events stating that he did pick her up from the job.
Hey.
Hey, thanks for the ride.
And when did you drop her back off at her apartment?
We actually never even made it back to her place.
He said he had to pick up something from his apartment in Norcross, so he parked the car and went inside while Angela remained in the car.
He was only gone a short time, maybe anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes.
Actually, when I got back to the car, she was gone.
He claims he didn't know where she went, and he told us that he had called her a couple of times after she came up missing.
That didn't concern you? You didn't call the police?
Honestly speaking, man, I thought she left with another guy.
He said that they got into an argument when he picked her up from the party. He was complaining about having to pick her up so late, and that made her angry.
I think it's about time for you to get your own car soon, especially with all that money you're making.
What is that supposed to mean?
She kept saying that there were plenty of guys who would have been happy to give her a ride. He also noticed that she was texting other people.
You know what? I can just get somebody else to pick me up.
Stop. Don't worry about it. Let's just get out of here.
Fine.
First, I'm gonna have to make a pit stop before we get to your place.
But when detectives ask Charles what he was grabbing so late in the night, he hesitates.
What did you need to pick up in Norcross?
I went to go pick up some weed.
Charles reluctantly tells police that he's a small-time drug dealer and he had to pick up some marijuana to drop off for a buyer on the way back.
Not only that, but Charles is currently on parole. He was previously incarcerated on drug charges, so this is not a good look.
Look, I don't want to get in trouble.
Detectives in Gwinnett County are speaking with Charles Outlaw about the disappearance of his friend, 26-year-old dancer Angela Rabate.
By all accounts, Charles is the last person to see Angela before she vanished.
And Charles has just admitted that on the night of her disappearance, he was working an illegal drug deal.
Charles reluctantly tells police that he's a small-time drug dealer and he had to pick up some marijuana to drop off for a buyer on the way back to Angela's home.
Not only that, but Charles is currently on parole. He was previously incarcerated on drug charges, so this is not a good look.
Look, I don't want to get in trouble.
Listen, Charles, we're not really worried about the drugs right now. We're more focused on Angela's missing person case.
Charles is relieved.
At that point in time, we wanted him to show me where he last saw Angela, and I asked him to take me on the route that he went when he went home that night.
Now that investigators have identified Angela's last known location, the search for her intensifies.
They had started to organize a search party.
It was at 10 o'clock at night, so it was dark. But again, we were on a mission. So, the detective came out. We were doing our best. We had flashlights, we had glow sticks.
The group scours the area late into the night. Sadly, they came up empty-handed.
I told everyone, listen, let's plan on getting back here tomorrow around 11 a.m. where we can use the daylight.
One person has been noticeably absent from the search. Angela's ex, Brian Dunn.
Someone else reached out for him and told him that she was missing. And he didn't have a car, so he was just like, okay, and then by day 2, he was there.
As the search continues, detectives take Brian aside to ask him some questions.
Anytime there's a case where somebody is missing, law enforcement is always going to look at some of the relationships that person has.
So tell us about your relationship with Angela.
Well, we dated for several years, and we have a daughter together.
How's the co-parenting situation?
It's been fine. No problems.
He indicated to me that they had a co-parenting relationship that was positive. He said that they weren't having any issues.
You haven't had any contact with her since Friday?
No. I didn't even know she was missing until today.
He seems genuinely concerned about Angela's disappearance.
I don't feel like he would harm a hair on her head. I think he still was in love with her, despite everything.
Just then, Brian spots Charles.
Hey!
Brian, it's his first time seeing Charles, and he has questions.
Why would you leave her in the car by herself?
Brian, I think, at one point was kind of pinpointing him and trying to say, no way you're going to come here and just leave Andy in the car and then her just disappear.
Man, you don't know me. What? Hell out
I
my
do,
face.
bro.
Get the hell out of my face.
What?
So they get into arguing, and then Charles goes off the rails.
And a physical altercation breaks out between Brian Dunn and Charles Outlaw.
Hey, break it up! Break it up!
I got in the middle of it, and I told both of them, listen, we're here for a purpose, which is to find Angela, and let's not jump to conclusions on what could have happened.
But as officers attempt to part the two men and restrain them, Charles does something unexpected.
He reached one of his hands into her pocket, pulled out what I later found out to be cocaine, and tried to throw the cocaine away.
What the hell's going on over here?
Between his earlier admission about the illegal drug dealing and being caught red-handed with cocaine, police couldn't let this slide.
I think at that point in time, he realized that he was going to go to jail. He tried to run.
But quick on their feet, officers soon get Charles back under control.
Everyone in the search party started to think that I was arresting Charles for Angela's disappearance, and that obviously was not the case. It was for a probation violation.
At this point, they don't have any hard evidence that Charles has lied to police or that he had any involvement in Angela's disappearance.
When I searched Charles's home, there wasn't any evidence inside the home that led us to where Angela was.
For all they know, she could be somewhere out there alive and well.
But as several more days pass without any sign of Angela, concern continues to mount.
Now, if she was still safe and alive, why wouldn't she have turned up by now?
Detectives are becoming increasingly suspicious that something terrible might have happened to Angela.
And on April 3rd, 6 days after Angela was last seen, the call comes into Gwinnett PD that everyone's been dreading.
Flynn?
They found a body.
All right, we'll be right there.
It was no longer a missing person. This was going to be a homicide investigation.
Six days after Angela Rabate vanished from an apartment complex in Gwinnett County, investigators have received the phone call everyone has been dreading.
Local surveyors alert them of a dead body found 20 miles away in Lilburn, Georgia.
Yep, we'll be right there.
She's right over there.
The location is on an industrial road that has nothing but businesses. And that particular area was about a 2-acre size lot of nothing but woods.
When investigators see the body, there's no doubt about it. This is Angela.
I had seen so many pictures of her that it was very evident that it was her immediately. We knew that this was going to be a homicide investigation, and it was no longer a missing person.
It's also clear Angela's death was no accident.
There was a gunshot wound to the back left side of her head.
This was a cold-blooded act of execution.
There was other clothing items, some shoes, boots, makeup bag, and a few personal items that were laying around that area.
The money counter that she had been seen with when she left was missing, as was the money that she had.
When the tragic news reaches Angela's loved ones, they're devastated.
Unfortunately, I had to give Angela's mom the news that it was Angela, that we had found her.
I got the phone call, and I was just numb. It was done. It was over. And my baby was gone.
My heart broke literally in half because of it. It just sucks that somebody just take her life like that. She was so young.
As Angela's loved ones continue to grieve, detectives kick the investigation into high gear.
Now that their missing persons investigation has become a homicide, detectives are more determined than ever to figure out exactly what happened to Angela Rabate.
Sergeant Flynn, he was amazing. Like, he was amazing. Like the empathy that he had towards the situation, the case, it was like, okay, we're gonna get to the bottom of it. It felt like he took it personal. So he started, honing in on Charles.
Have them ready for us. We're on our way back.
Investigators sit down with Charles Outlaw at the Gwinnett County Jail, where he's already in custody on the probation violation.
We didn't tell him initially that we found the body.
Regardless, Charles is clearly feeling the heat.
During the interview, Charles comes across as paranoid and agitated. He claims that people are trying to set him up, and even at one point in the interview, he begins banging on the table to get his point across.
I wish there was a woman, man. I wish I never went together, man. That's just how really it is, man. You see what I'm saying? Just real talk, man, because I don't need this in my life right now. I'm already locked up for no reason.
Hoping to get Charles to spill what he knows, detectives finally break the tragic news of Angela's death.
The game's changed a little bit here, okay? So we found Angela today. She's dead, okay?
When we told him that we found the body of Angela, Charles Outlaw threw a fit.
Are you all right down there? You want to sit in the chair? You need to take a minute, you can take a minute.
It's a shocking display of emotion, but it strikes the investigators as disingenuous.
He was crying and screaming, and it was all an act. It was overkill.
After letting Charles's explosion die down, investigators continue the interrogation.
This is your opportunity to say, you're the last person to be seen here. This is your opportunity to clear your name. You understand what I'm saying? I believe I'm just going to exercise my right. You know what I mean? To have an attorney to kind of guide me. You see what I'm saying?
Charles asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any more questions.
That shut the conversation down, but investigators have no doubt in their minds they have the right guy in custody.
Now more convinced than ever that Charles is Angela's killer, investigators start digging for more evidence to prove it.
As they interview more and more of Angela's friends, detectives are eventually put in touch with a guy named Paul Jacobs.
Appreciate you calling me back.
Yeah, this is crazy right now. It's really crazy.
He told me over the phone that he had met Charles the week before, that he didn't really like Charles.
I do not like him. This guy is scary.
Paul says on March 30th, the day after Angela went missing, he came face to face with Charles that afternoon.
He had been at a car wash the day after Angela disappeared, and while he was there, he immediately recognized Charles Outlaw.
He would look like he had just struck oil on Sunday.
Oh, like he had gone out and bought a bunch of new clothes?
Yeah.
According to Paul, Charles was acting incredibly odd.
Paul noticed that Charles was detailing every part of his car.
This guy, he was uneasy. He was honestly looking around. He wouldn't sit down for nothing for like 45 minutes. They were detailing hell out of this car. They were doing everything.
Paul Jacobs told me that Charles was very insistent on the employees cleaning the inside of the car, just being overbearing about how he wanted the car cleaned.
Paul said that Charles was also flashing lots of cash, mostly small bills.
He says he was tipping the staff at the car wash tons of money.
This dude tipped these kids like crazy. It was just something that was so strange, and this dude was in there spending way too much money just by seeing them and the way he was acting. Something's not right.
Charles was the last person to be seen with Angela. Now, the following day after she was missing, he was cleaning the car, wearing brand new clothing.
They also have to wonder if the cash he was throwing around could have been Angela's tips from the party on Friday night.
Those were all, red flags for us. Okay, there's something going on here.
All right, thank you.
All right.
All right, bye-bye.
And when investigators file a warrant to search Charles's vehicle, they uncover another unsettling piece of information.
Mr. Outlaw's car. It was a rent-a-car.
Who in their right mind cleans a rental car very well prior to turning it in, knowing the rental car company is going to clean it also in detail? So that's a very suspicious act to go along with everything else.
They immediately confiscate the car and have it analyzed by their forensics team.
This was the same car that we knew that he had driven Angela in the night that she went missing. We were able to find the gunshot residue on the roof of the car that indicated that a gunshot had gone off inside the car. Although Charles tried to clean the car out and detail it and get rid of any evidence that was in there, he forgot to clean the roof of the car.
It's damning evidence, but investigators are about to get an even bigger slam dunk.
This is Detective Ross.
They received word that Charles's roommate wants to speak with them.
Charles had actually confessed to him that he had killed Angela.
Gwinnett County detectives have zeroed in on Charles Outlaw as the prime suspect in Angela Rabate's murder.
The evidence against him is just piling up at this point. Not only was he the last person to be with Angela before she disappeared, but he was also seen getting his car detailed the day after she went missing. And police found gun residue on the roof of that same vehicle.
But investigators are about to get another slam dunk.
This is Detective Ross.
They received word that Charles's roommate wants to speak with them.
You kidding me?
Charles had actually confessed to him that he had killed Angela.
When detectives sit down with Charles's roommate, Willie Daniels, he doesn't hold back.
So it's real serious.
Willie tells the police that on the night Angela went missing, Charles Outlaw woke him up in the early morning hours to make a confession.
Hey, wake up.
He was trying to paint you, it looked like there's something like wrong or something like seriously wrong, something ain't right at all.
What's going on?
Charles Outlaw told him that he'd had a struggle with Angela, that she had a gun.
His exact words was, him with a whole girl age attitude about something. It was hard. She had some little gun or something that he said he was kind of wrestling over it, accidentally went off. He was just like, man, I think I'm gonna kill on girl with this gun. I'm like, what?
So that the words he used?
Yeah, he was like, if you don't kill, I think I would kill things.
After confessing, Willie says Charles became terrified at the idea of being caught.
I cannot go back to prison, man. Like, I can't.
Willie says that Charles started to panic and he jumped up and started stripping off his clothes, saying that he needed to get rid of the evidence.
And he was just like, man, I gotta take my clothes, I just want my clothes. And he started talking about, he's in the daze, he don't know what's going on. So he's real panicking. He's talking to me like, man, I don't know what I'm doing.
Willie says that's when Charles turned on him.
You got my back, right?
Yeah, I got your back.
He threatened Willie that he would have some sort of harm done to him or his family were he to tell law enforcement what Charles Outlaw had confessed to him.
He trying to tell me, like, man, I just gonna say nothing to nobody, man. Like I told you, he threatened my family, but he told me he knows my baby mother, he know where everybody stay at.
Detectives eventually confront Willie and ask if he helped Charles get rid of the body or the murder weapon, but he denies it.
He confronted, like, all that I just told you, that's what he got off his chest. After that, I didn't go digging, like, hey, so what did you do with this? What did you do with that? So I was just kind of like, me just knowing that was just enough.
He didn't ask for your help?
He didn't ask for my help on nothing.
Willie says he wished he had come forward earlier, but he was afraid of what Charles might do to his family.
With Charles now incarcerated on the drug charges, Willie felt safer giving a statement to police.
And with Willie's statement in tow, investigators believe they have everything they need to charge Charles with Angela's murder.
At this point, Charles Outlaw was then arrested at the jail for the murder of Angela Rabate.
We charged him with murder, felony murder, and concealing the death of a person.
But obtaining justice for Angela Rabate will be easier said than done.
We finally get a court date for August in 2016, and all of a sudden, they declare a mistrial.
In the spring of 2016, Gwinnett County Police have finally charged Charles Outlaw for the murder of 26-year-old single mother Angela Rabate.
I can remember the phone call like it was yesterday when I finally got the call saying that they were charging him. And we were actually on a car trip going to California, and we just pulled over the car and screamed for joy.
On August 15th, 2016, Charles's murder trial begins.
Fast forward, we finally get a court date for August in 2016. The first day of court, we're sitting there and it's hard. It's hard seeing him in court. It's hard knowing that we're about to relive our worst nightmare through all of this.
He came into trial, with the glasses on and, very postured. He had no one. There was no one sitting on his side. There was absolutely not one person there for him at all.
But just as the prosecution is getting started, the trial faces a setback.
They get into testimony and all of a sudden they declare a mistrial from something that supposedly had been agreed upon pre-trial.
In this case, it was agreed by both parties that the jury should not hear evidence of Charles Outlaw's prior criminal activity or the reason that he was arrested for having a small amount of drugs on him during the search for Angela. But one of the recordings of Outlaw talking to a detective unfortunately included mention that he had been on probation in the past.
For Angela's loved ones and Gwinnett County law enforcement alike, the mistrial is a crushing blow.
And that was very concerning because a lot of times cases are not retried after a mistrial.
It was devastating to me. I didn't know if this was a sign of the things to come, that he was gonna get away with this. So I'm now wondering, are we even gonna get justice for my baby?
We were worried. We felt like, okay, well, if this happens, what if Angie's life is just gonna go in vain because this man who killed her is out, living his best life.
Matt Akoff was an angel, the DA, because he was like, Judy, we will do whatever we can to get this back on the calendar during this next week.
And Matt makes good on his promise.
Fortunately, we were able to tee it right back up for trial.
They did it. They pulled it off. They got a new jury impaneled and went ahead and proceeded with the trial. We started all over the next week.
The defense described the prosecution's case as a spaghetti prosecution. He claimed that we were just throwing things against the wall to see what would stick. I explained to a jury that this is like when a 2-year-old eats spaghetti and everything sticks to the wall. It all pointed towards Charles Outlaw.
The state accepts that the first part of Charles' story is true, that he and Angela really did get into a fight on the drive back to Gwinnett County.
Charles's own admission is that they got into an argument because he had to drive all the way across the city to get her.
But prosecutors believe there was more to the argument than that.
Charles wanted to be romantically involved with Angela, but she didn't want to have anything to do with him.
After everything that I've done for you, this is how you gonna do me?
I don't owe you anything, Charles.
She was smart. She was resourceful. So if Charles was offering her rides to and from this and that, she would do it. But that didn't mean she was going to be his girlfriend or anything like that.
And he believed she was using him for rides and other things without being willing to grow their relationship.
Well, I'll just get somebody else to give me rides from now on.
When she said there were other guys waiting in line, he snapped.
You been playing with me this whole time, setting me up.
That's not the case, Charles.
Prove.
Prosecutors also concede that Angela may have very well drawn her pistol to protect herself, but they assert that the injury that killed her is not consistent with an accident.
There was just no way that this could have been an accident, not with a press contact type wound on the back of the head.
Instead of seeking help, Charles dumped Angela's body in the nearby town of Lilburn and tried to cover up the crime.
He even participated in the search efforts when he knew all along where he'd hidden her body.
At the end of a week-long trial, the jury retires to deliberate.
I was so nervous. I've never been so nervous in my life.
We just cried and we prayed and we just, hoped that the jury would do the right thing. This is crazy, but when the jury went to deliberate, we seen like 20 yellow butterflies flying around the street. And I was like, that's Angie. We're gonna get justice.
After several hours of deliberation, the jury returns with their verdict.
The jury finds Charles guilty on all charges.
Charles Outlaw was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 15 years for hiding her body.
It was what we needed. It was what we needed. We got our justice.
I was thankful that we were able to give Angie the justice that she deserved, and for him to be given life without the possibility of parole. Plus 15 years. That was like icing on the cake.
Yet even with the case finally closed, the pain of losing Angela still lingers on for her loved ones.
Angie was on the verge of getting what she wanted in life, of going for her goals and actually accomplishing them. That she was so close.
I feel like it was a fatal attraction. Charles was infatuated with Angie. When he realized that those feelings weren't reciprocated, he didn't feel valued as a man, and this is what caused him to do that.
As human beings, I think we are inclined to trust people and put our trust into those people that we feel comfortable with. But Charles was not someone that Angela could trust. So I think this is a cautionary tale that trust is earned.
The takeaway from this is watch the company that you keep.
The world lost a beautiful light. Someone that would lift you up. She did for me. She was my rock. She was my comfort. And she was the sunshine and the brightness that I don't see anymore.
I want people to know that she was a great mother. She wasn't what her job defined her as. She was doing this for her daughter so she could provide for her child. Angela was amazing.
At 1:48 in the morning, on August 13, 2018, Sharnan Watts was home. She had been away on a business trip, and the quiet streets of Frederick, Colorado, were settling into the late hours of the night. A friend, Nicole Atkinson, drove Sharnan back to the house on Saratoga Trail. Sharnan walked inside, returning to the place where her husband and two little daughters were supposed to be waiting for her. She was 34 years old. She was pregnant with her third child. By the time the sun rose, she would be gone. Her two daughters, Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, 3, would be gone with her. And the life that had looked ordinary from the outside would become the center of one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern American crime. Only hours earlier, there had been nothing about the house that suggested an ending was approaching. There was a family. There were children. There was a home. There were the familiar objects of everyday life, the things that make a house feel occupied even when everyone is asleep. But somewhere between that late-night return and the morning light, something happened behind those walls that would destroy the Watts family forever. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a crime scene, but from silence. Sharnan had a medical appointment scheduled for the morning. She did not appear. Nicole Atkinson tried to contact her. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. At first, worry could still have had 100 innocent explanations. Perhaps Sharnan was exhausted after traveling. Perhaps she was asleep. Perhaps her phone was misplaced. Perhaps something had delayed her. But then Nicole went to the house. The details waiting there did not fit the ordinary explanations. Sharnan's vehicle was still in the garage. The children's car seats were still inside. The family was not simply absent in the way a family might be absent on a normal morning. It felt as though something had stopped in the middle of an ordinary day before that day had even begun. Nicole could not fully enter because an interior lock was obstructing the door. She contacted police and asked them to check on Sharnan and the children. Then Chris Watts appeared. At that moment, investigators did not yet know that they were looking at the man who would become the central figure in the case. Chris presented himself as a husband whose wife and daughters had disappeared. There was no immediate confession. There was no dramatic revelation. There was simply a missing family and a man standing in the middle of the uncertainty. And then came the cameras. Chris appeared before the media and asked for his family to come home. His face was tense. His words carried the appearance of desperation. To anyone watching from a distance, he seemed to be a father waiting for his wife and children to return safely. But investigators were already looking more closely. A neighbor's security camera had captured activity around the Watts home that morning. The footage showed Chris moving his vehicle and apparently loading items into it. That image mattered. Not because a single movement could prove murder, but because it raised a question that would become increasingly difficult to ignore. Why would a man whose wife and children had supposedly vanished behave that way? As investigators examined the house, the family, and the timeline, another layer of the story began to emerge. The marriage had been under strain. And Chris had begun a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. According to the information that later became part of the case, Chris wanted a different life. He wanted to leave the marriage and move toward a future with Kessinger. But Sharnan was still his wife. And she was carrying their third child. That contradiction sits at the heart of the tragedy. A person can leave a marriage. A person can walk away from a house. A person can ask for a divorce, endure an argument, face financial consequences, and rebuild a life. None of those choices require a grave. None require a child to disappear. Yet as investigators moved closer to Chris, the story he gave them began to change. At first, he denied killing his wife or children. Then he offered another explanation. He claimed that Sharnan had killed Bella and Celeste. According to the version he initially presented, he had confronted Sharnan about the state of their marriage. He said that after he told her the relationship was over, she became angry and killed the girls. He then claimed that he killed Sharnan after discovering what she had done. It was a story designed to place the first act of violence in someone else's hands. But investigators did not accept it. The pressure continued. The questions continued. And eventually, Chris Watts began to admit the truth. Sharnan had not killed the girls. Chris was responsible for the deaths of all three. The horror did not end at the house. After killing his family, Chris transported their bodies to the oil field site, where he worked for Anadarko Petroleum. Sharnan was buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were placed inside oil tanks. The location that had been part of Chris's working life became the place where he tried to conceal the people who had once been the center of his home life. On August 16, investigators recovered the bodies. The missing person case was over. But the answers were more terrible than the disappearance. There was Sharnan, a young mother who had returned home only hours before her death. There was Bella, a 4-year-old child. There was Celeste, only 3 years old. And there was Nico, the unborn baby Sharnan was carrying. 4 lives had been taken from the family. 4 futures had been erased. And the man who had stood before television cameras asking for his family to come home was the man responsible. In the days that followed, America struggled with the same question. Why? Why would a father kill his own children? Why would a husband kill a pregnant wife? Why would someone choose annihilation when other doors remained open? The prosecution's explanation centered on Chris's desire for a new life. His marriage was collapsing. He had a new relationship. He wanted to separate himself from the family he already had. But motive is not the same as justification. There is no ordinary explanation for an extraordinary act of violence. And there is no relationship crisis that makes the deaths of children inevitable. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to the charges against him. He would not receive a full trial. Instead, the legal process moved toward sentencing. On November 19, he was sentenced to multiple life terms, including 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole for the murders. The courtroom could establish punishment. It could establish responsibility. It could close the legal file. But it could not restore the family. That is where this story truly begins to feel different from the headlines. Because the Watts case is often remembered through the face of Chris Watts. The interrogations. The cameras. The changing story. The confession. The sentence. But Sharnan, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were not a headline. They were people. They had routines, relationships, hopes, arguments, plans, and ordinary mornings that once seemed guaranteed to continue. Their story was not supposed to end on Saratoga Trail. And yet, in the early hours of August 13, 2018, something inside that home changed forever. The house remained. The street remained. The neighboring homes remained. Morning arrived as it always did. But the family that had lived there was gone. And as investigators began reconstructing the final hours of their lives, every small detail became important. The late-night return, the unanswered messages, the car in the garage, the children's seats, the security footage, the man's changing story, and the terrible distance between what the world saw and what had actually happened. This was no longer simply a missing family investigation. It was the beginning of a search for the truth behind a carefully ordinary life. And the deeper investigators looked, the more they discovered that the most frightening part of the case was not hidden somewhere far away. It had been inside the family all along. The questions would become darker with every answer. Investigators would have to separate appearance from reality, confession from manipulation, and evidence from assumption. They would retrace a timeline measured not in years, but in hours. They would examine what happened inside the house, what happened on the road, and what happened at the work site where traces of the family were found. And beyond the evidence, a question would remain human. How could a home that had contained children's laughter become the starting point of a crime that ended 4 lives? To understand that question, we have to go back before the disappearance, before the cameras, before the confession, and look at this family. Frederick, Colorado, was the kind of place where a tragedy like this seemed almost impossible. The town sat north of Denver, surrounded by the wide-open landscape of the Front Range. The mountains were visible in the distance, but life in the neighborhoods was quieter and more predictable. Streets were lined with houses that looked much like one another, driveways filled with family cars, garages protecting the ordinary possessions of ordinary lives. This was not a place people associated with a family disappearing overnight. It was a place where children played outside, where neighbors recognized familiar vehicles, where people went to work in the morning and came home in the evening. And on Saratoga Trail, the Watts family lived behind the walls of one of those houses. From the outside, there was little to distinguish it from the homes around it. Inside lived Chris Watts, Sharnan Watts, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. Soon, there would have been another child. Sharnan was pregnant. The family was preparing for a future that, at least on the surface, seemed to be moving forward. The house was not simply a place where they slept. It was the center of their family life. It was where the children grew up, where meals were prepared, where routines were repeated, where birthdays and ordinary mornings became memories without anyone realizing they were memories. There are houses that remain in the mind, because something extraordinary happened inside them. The Watts home became one of those houses. But before it became a crime scene, it was simply home. Sharnan was an energetic woman who shared parts of her life publicly. Photographs and posts presented an image of family activity, children, work, and plans for the future. Her daughters were young enough that much of their world still revolved around their parents. Bella was 4. Celeste was 3. Their lives were built around routines that adults often take for granted. Getting dressed, eating, playing, going to bed, waking up, seeing their parents, knowing where their mother was and where their father was. For a child, home is supposed to be the safest geography in the world. A bedroom is not supposed to become a crime scene. A parent's arms are not supposed to become a source of danger. And a family photograph is not supposed to become evidence of a life that has already ended. Yet in the summer of 2018, something inside the Watts household was changing. The photographs did not necessarily reveal it. The house did not announce it. The street did not know it. But the marriage between Chris and Sharnan had begun to deteriorate. Chris worked in the oil industry, a job that could take him away from the domestic world of the family. Sharnan had her own professional interests, and was deeply involved in the children's lives. From a distance, they appeared to be building a life together. But relationships are rarely as simple as photographs suggest. Behind closed doors, disagreements can become patterns. Silence can replace conversation. Distance can grow even while two people continue living under the same roof. By the summer of 2018, the relationship was under serious strain. And then there was another woman. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker of Chris. What began as a relationship outside the marriage would become one of the most important elements in understanding what happened next. Chris had begun imagining a different future. A future without Sharnan. A future in which he could leave the marriage and move forward with someone else. But there was a problem that could not simply be erased by wanting a new life. His old life still existed. His wife still existed. His children still existed. And Sharnan was carrying their third child. The pregnancy made the situation even more complicated. The family was not merely living through a marital crisis. There was a baby on the way. There were plans for another child. There was a future being discussed and anticipated while, at the same time, Chris was privately moving emotionally toward a completely different future. That contradiction would later become one of the darkest aspects of the case. Sharnan did not know that the man beside her was imagining a life without her. At least, she did not appear to understand the full extent of what was happening. She continued living within the family structure. She continued making plans. She continued preparing for the arrival of another child. And the children remained at the center of that world. For investigators, reconstructing those final weeks would become essential. Because murder does not begin when the police arrive. The physical act may occur in minutes or hours, but the story behind it can develop over weeks, months, sometimes years. In the Watts case, investigators would eventually look backward. They would examine the marriage. They would examine Chris's behavior. They would examine his relationship with Kessinger. They would examine conversations, movements, messages, and plans. They would try to understand what was happening in the mind of a man who appeared to be living an ordinary suburban life, while privately considering an entirely different future. But at the beginning of August 2018, the family was still together. On August 12, Sharnan was away on a business trip. She was not at home in Colorado. The distance between her and the house was temporary. She was coming back. That detail matters, because the tragedy was not something that happened to a family already separated by geography. Sharnan was returning home. She was returning to her husband. She was returning to Bella and Celeste. She was returning to the house on Saratoga Trail. And she was pregnant. Late that night, she arrived back in Colorado. Nicole Atkinson, a friend, drove her home. It was around 1:48 in the morning when Sharnan arrived at the house. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people were asleep. There was nothing visible from the outside to suggest that this would be the final time Sharnan entered her home alive. Imagine that moment without knowing what would happen next. A woman returning after a trip. A familiar street. A familiar driveway. A familiar front door. Inside were the people who were supposed to be waiting for her. Her husband. Her daughters. Her home. She had no reason to imagine that she was stepping into the final hours of her life. And perhaps that is what makes the timeline so disturbing. There was no dramatic warning. No public confrontation. No crowd watching. No immediate sign that the world was about to change. The night simply continued. Then morning approached. In another part of Frederick, life began as usual. People prepared for work. Cars moved through the streets. The sun rose over Colorado. But inside the Watts household, the ordinary sequence of a family mourning had been broken. Sharnan had a medical appointment scheduled for later that morning. She did not arrive. That absence would become the first visible crack in the story. At first, it was only an appointment missed. Then there were unanswered calls. Then unanswered messages. Then the concern of a friend. And eventually, someone went to the house. What followed would transform Saratoga Trail from a quiet residential street into the center of a national investigation. But before the police arrived, before the cameras appeared, before the confession, the house still looked like a home. The children's belongings were there. The family vehicles were there. The rooms still contained the traces of ordinary life. Nothing about the street itself could explain what had happened. That is one of the most unsettling characteristics of crime scenes involving families. The objects remain after the people are gone. A child's possession can sit exactly where it was left. A vehicle can remain parked in a garage. A room can look untouched. The physical environment can preserve a version of normality long after normality has disappeared. The Watts house would soon become filled with investigators searching for answers. But before evidence was collected, there was uncertainty. Where was Sharnan? Where were Bella and Celeste? Why was the family missing? Why was the car still there? Why had Sharnan failed to attend her appointment? And most importantly, what had happened between the moment she returned home and the moment someone realized she was gone? At first, nobody outside that house knew the answer. Not the neighbors. Not the public. Not the media. And not even the investigators, who had just arrived. There was only a family that had vanished from its own home. Chris Watts would soon tell people that he wanted them back. He would stand before cameras and speak as a husband and father asking for help. To the outside world, the story appeared simple. A wife and 2 children were missing. A worried husband wanted them found. But behind that apparent simplicity was a marriage that had been breaking apart, an affair that had remained hidden from the public, a pregnancy, and a man who had already begun imagining a life beyond his family. The contrast between those 2 realities would become the foundation of the investigation. One reality was visible. The family photographs. The suburban home. The children. The pregnancy. The smiling faces. The ordinary routines. The other reality was hidden. The tension. The affair. The desire for separation. The private thoughts that no photograph could capture. And somewhere between those 2 realities was the truth about what happened inside the Watts home. That truth would emerge piece by piece. First through a friend's concern. Then through a police investigation. Then through surveillance footage. Then through questions that became harder for Chris Watts to answer. And finally, through a confession that would reveal just how far the reality inside that ordinary-looking home had moved from the life the outside world believed it was seeing. But before the confession, there was a family. Before the investigation, there was a home. Before the headlines, there were 2 little girls who knew their mother and father as the center of their world. And before the tragedy became a case file, Sharnan Watts was simply a woman coming home. She had spent the night traveling back to Colorado. At 1:48 in the morning, she stepped through the door. She did not know that the hours ahead would become the final chapter of her life. She did not know that her daughters would never leave the house alive. She did not know that the man standing beside her would eventually become one of the most notorious family killers in the United States. And she could not have known that, only days later, people across the country would be watching her photographs, listening to the details of her final hours, and asking how such a tragedy could have happened inside a home that looked so ordinary from the outside. The answer would not be found in the mountains. It would not be found in a stranger hiding in the neighborhood. It would begin inside the family itself. And to understand the weight of what was lost, the next step is not to look at Chris Watts. It is to look at Sharnan, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child who had names, plans, and a future that would never arrive. Before Sharnan Watts became a name in a criminal investigation, she was a woman with plans. Before Bella and Celeste became names in police reports, they were little girls with small routines, familiar smiles, and a world that still revolved around their parents. And before the unborn child became part of the final count of victims, he was simply a baby waiting to be born. Their lives had existed long before the headlines. That is where their story should begin. Sharnan was 34 years old in the summer of 2018. She was energetic, involved in her family, and accustomed to sharing pieces of her life with the people around her. Her world was busy. There were children to care for, work responsibilities, family matters, appointments, plans, and the countless small tasks that fill the days of a mother with young children. Her life was not extraordinary because it was famous. It was ordinary because it was hers. She had a home. She had 2 daughters. She had a husband. And she was pregnant again. That pregnancy represented another chapter that the family expected to enter together. The baby was a boy. His name was going to be Nico. There was something almost painfully hopeful about that name. It belonged to a future that had not yet arrived. A child who had not yet taken his first breath already had a place in the family's imagination. There would have been another bedroom, another set of clothes, another small voice in the house. There would have been sleepless nights and bottles, doctor visits and birthdays, arguments over toys, laughter at the dinner table, and the countless ordinary moments that make a family feel permanent. For Shanann, the pregnancy meant that the family was growing. For the children, it meant they were going to have a little brother. For Chris, however, the same future existed alongside a private desire to move in another direction. That contrast would become devastating. But Shanann did not wake up every morning thinking about the possibility of violence. She was living her life. She was making plans. She was preparing for a future that she believed was still there. Her daughters were at the heart of that future. Bella was 4 years old. At 4, the world is still small enough to be understood through people. A mother. A father. A sister. A familiar bedroom. A favorite toy. A meal. A bedtime. A morning. A 4-year-old does not understand the complicated architecture of adult relationships. She does not understand an affair. She does not understand financial pressure, marital dissatisfaction, or the private thoughts of an adult who has decided that his life should change. She understands who picks her up, who feeds her, who holds her, who tells her it is time to sleep, who comes back home. For Bella, her parents were not characters in a marriage. They were her parents. Celeste was even younger. 3 years old. She was still at an age when the world was experienced through immediate sensations and familiar faces. Her home was not simply a building. It was the place where she belonged. The 2 girls shared the kind of childhood closeness that comes from growing up side by side. They were sisters. They were children. They had years ahead of them. And nobody looking at them from the outside could have known how little time remained. That is one of the cruelest elements of any tragedy involving children. A child does not know that an ordinary morning might be the last ordinary morning. A child does not understand the meaning of a final photograph. A child does not know that a familiar room can suddenly become the last place they will ever see. Bella and Celeste were simply living. And Shanann was their mother. The relationship between a mother and her children is built through repetition. 1,000 small acts. A hand reaching out. A face appearing in a doorway. A meal placed on a table. A blanket pulled over a sleeping child. A question asked for the 100th time. A laugh that comes from somewhere in the next room. Those moments rarely make the news. They are too ordinary. But they are the substance of family life. And that is what was destroyed. The Watts family also had a public image. Shanann frequently shared aspects of her life, including her family and children. Photographs showed a household that appeared active and connected. The girls appeared as part of a young family building its future. From the outside, people saw pieces of the story. They saw Chris. They saw Shanann. They saw Bella. They saw Celeste. They saw a pregnant mother. They saw a family preparing for another child. But photographs cannot show everything. A photograph cannot record a silence between two spouses. It cannot reveal a private argument after the camera is turned off. It cannot show one person lying awake while another sleeps. It cannot reveal an affair. It cannot tell you that someone who appears beside you in a family photograph is privately imagining a life without you. That was the invisible part of the Watts family story. By the summer of 2018, the marriage between Sharnan and Chris was under serious strain. Chris had become involved with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker. The relationship was not simply an isolated secret. It became connected to Chris's idea of what his future might look like. He wanted out. He wanted something different. And the more strongly he focused on that imagined future, the more complicated his existing life became. Because Sharnan was still there. The children were still there. The unborn baby was still there. A family cannot be erased simply because one person no longer wants to be part of it. There are legal processes. There are conversations. There are painful separations. There are custody arrangements. There are years of difficult adjustments. But there are also ways to leave. Chris had those options. Sharnan and the children did not. That distinction would become central to the tragedy. The family was not simply facing a difficult marriage. They were standing at the edge of a decision that Chris had already begun making privately. Yet Sharnan continued moving forward with her life. She traveled. She worked. She cared for her children. She maintained plans for the future. And she was preparing to become a mother of 3. In another life, the summer of 2018 might have become a family memory. They might have remembered the pregnancy. They might have remembered Bella's 4th year and Celeste's 3rd. They might have remembered the house on Saratoga Trail as the place where the family grew. They might have looked back years later at old photographs and laughed about things that seemed important at the time, but were forgotten later. None of that happened. The future disappeared before it could become memory. There is a particular kind of cruelty in the death of a pregnant mother. The loss is not limited to one person. It is the destruction of a future that had already begun to take shape. Nico had not yet been born, but his existence was real. He had a name. He had parents. He had sisters. He was expected. He belonged to the family before he ever entered the world. And when Sharnan died, Nico died with her. Bella and Celeste were different. They had already lived. They had already formed memories. They had already learned their mother's voice. They had already experienced the world. Their absence would therefore not be an abstract idea. It would be felt in the empty spaces of the house. The missing footsteps. The missing laughter. The missing requests for attention. The missing goodnight. For those left behind, grief would not arrive only once. It would return through ordinary things. A photograph. A birthday. A room. A toy. A memory. A name. That is why remembering the victims requires more than listing their ages. A number cannot describe a child. 4 years cannot describe Bella. 3 years cannot describe Celeste. 34 years cannot describe Sharnan. And the absence of a birth cannot describe Nico. They were more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were a family. And for a time, they believed they had a future. On August 12, Sharnan was away on a business trip. The trip itself was part of an ordinary adult life, the kind of temporary separation that families experience every day. She was expected to come home. And eventually, she did. In the early morning hours of August 13th, Nicole Atkinson drove her back to the house. The time was approximately 1:48 a.m. Sharnan was home again. That simple fact carries enormous weight when viewed from the future. She had returned. She had crossed the distance between where she had been and where her family lived. She entered the house. Perhaps she expected to see the familiar faces of her children. Perhaps she expected to sleep after the trip. Perhaps she was already thinking about the next day's appointment. There was nothing about that moment that announced the end. No warning appeared on the walls. No sign outside the house told the neighborhood that a mother and her daughters were approaching their final hours. The night remained quiet. And inside that quiet house were the people Sharnan trusted. Her husband. Her daughters. Her unborn son. The family she believed she was returning to. By morning, she would not answer her phone. She would not attend her medical appointment. She would not leave the house again. Bella would not wake up and continue another day of childhood. Celeste would not grow another year older. Nico would never be born. And the future Sharnan had been carrying inside her would disappear with her. The tragedy becomes even more difficult to comprehend when we remember how young the children were. Bella had barely begun to understand the world. Celeste was only beginning to develop her own identity. Neither had the ability to comprehend the danger around them. They trusted the adults who controlled their environment. They depended upon them completely. That dependence makes the crime particularly devastating. Children do not have the freedom adults have. They cannot simply walk away from a dangerous situation. They cannot recognize manipulation. They cannot understand why a trusted parent might suddenly become a threat. They rely on adults to protect them. And in the Watts case, the person who should have represented protection became the source of the danger. That fact would become one of the most painful realities for everyone who later studied the case. But in the final hours before the truth emerged, none of that was known. There was only a family. A mother returning home. 2 little girls. An unborn child. And a father who was already hiding a private life from the people closest to him. The difference between what Sharnan believed and what Chris knew would soon become enormous. She believed she was coming home. Chris knew more than he was saying. And somewhere inside that gap between belief and reality, the final hours of the Watts family were unfolding. The world would later study those hours repeatedly. Investigators would reconstruct them. Journalists would describe them. People watching from thousands of miles away would search photographs for clues that were invisible at the time. But Sharnan did not have the luxury of knowing the ending. Neither did Bella. Neither did Celeste. And Nico never had the chance to know anything at all. They were not born into a crime story. They were born, lived, and loved as a family. That is how they should be remembered. Not by the darkness of the final hours alone, but by the life that existed before them. Sharnan was a mother preparing for another child. Bella was a 4-year-old girl with a childhood ahead of her. Celeste was a 3-year-old girl who should have had decades ahead of her. Nico was a baby who should have entered the world surrounded by his family. Their story had begun long before August 13, 2018. And for a brief moment, the future still belonged to them. Then the night came. And everything changed. The night of August 12, 2018, did not look like the beginning of a crime. It looked like the end of an ordinary trip. Sharnan Watts was coming home to Colorado after being away on business. The distance between her and her family was about to disappear. Her daughters were waiting at home. Her husband was there. The house on Saratoga Trail was waiting for her. At approximately 1:48 in the morning on August 13th, Nicole Atkinson drove Sharnan back to the Watts residence. It was late. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the houses around them were dark. Sharnan stepped out of the vehicle and went inside. It was the kind of arrival that happens in thousands of homes every night. A person comes back from a trip. A car pulls away. A door closes. The family prepares to begin another day. But Sharnan would never see another morning. Inside the house were her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. Bella was 4. Celeste was 3. And Sharnan was carrying their unborn brother, Nico. Whatever happened inside that house during the next few hours would end 4 lives and transform an ordinary suburban home into one of the most infamous crime scenes in the United States. The precise sequence of those final hours would later become one of the most disturbing questions in the investigation. What happened after Sharnan came home? What was said between husband and wife? When did the argument begin? When did Chris Watts decide that there would be no future for the family? And what happened to the children? Those questions would remain at the center of the case, because the man responsible would tell investigators more than one version of what happened. The first version was not the truth. Chris Watts eventually told investigators that he had confronted Sharnan about the state of their marriage. He wanted the relationship to end. He had been involved with Nicole Kessinger, and he wanted a different life. But Sharnan was still his wife. She was also the mother of his children. And she was pregnant. The conflict between those realities became the foundation of the tragedy. According to the story Chris initially gave investigators, Sharnan became responsible for the deaths of the children. He claimed that after he told her their relationship was over, she killed Bella and Celeste. Then, he said, he killed Sharnan. That version of events would later collapse. The investigators did not accept it. And the more closely they examined the evidence, the more difficult it became for Chris to maintain the story. Eventually, he admitted that Sharnan had not killed the girls. He was responsible for their deaths. The confession changed everything. The missing person investigation became a homicide investigation. But the horror was not confined to the house. After killing Sharnan and the children, Chris transported their bodies to the oil field site, where he worked for Anadarko Petroleum. This decision revealed another disturbing aspect of the crime. The location was not random. It was connected to his working life. It was a place he knew. A place where he understood the surroundings. A place where he believed he could hide what he had done. Sharnan was buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were placed inside oil tanks. The children who had belonged in bedrooms, in a family home, in the ordinary world of childhood, were now hidden in an industrial landscape. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. There had been a house. There had been a family. There had been a pregnant mother preparing for another child. There had been 2 little girls who depended entirely upon their parents. And now there were bodies concealed at a place connected to their father's work. Chris then returned to the world as if the family had simply disappeared. That detail would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. He did not immediately present himself as the person responsible. Instead, he allowed the disappearance to become a mystery. His wife was missing. His daughters were missing. And he appeared to be the husband and father searching for them. But a mystery built around a missing family could not remain unexplained for long. The first person to become seriously alarmed was Nicole Atkinson. She had been the one who brought Sharnan home. When Sharnan failed to respond the following morning, concern turned into fear. There were reasons to believe something was wrong. Shanann had a medical appointment scheduled for that morning. She did not attend. Her phone was not answering. Her children were not accounted for. And the family's vehicles were still there. Nicole went to the house. The details she encountered did not fit the idea of a woman simply leaving unexpectedly. Shanann's vehicle remained in the garage. The children's car seats were still inside. The house contained the ordinary signs of a family that should have been there. But the people themselves were missing. Nicole could not fully open the door because an interior lock was obstructing it. She contacted police. That call would become the beginning of the official investigation. At that moment, however, nobody outside the house knew the full truth. Police did not yet know they were dealing with a family murder. They were responding to a welfare concern involving a pregnant woman and 2 young children. Chris Watts arrived as the investigation began. His behavior would soon attract attention. He told authorities that his wife and daughters were gone. He did not initially tell them that he had killed them. Instead, he became the face of the disappearance. Then came the public appeal. Chris stood before television cameras and asked for his family to come home. To anyone watching without knowledge of the hidden events, he appeared to be a frightened husband. His family had disappeared. His wife was pregnant. His daughters were small. He wanted them back. But investigators were beginning to notice details that did not fit the picture. One of the most important pieces of information came from a neighbor. Nathan Trinistick had a security camera that captured activity around the Watts property. The footage showed Chris moving his vehicle out of the garage that morning. He appeared to be loading items into the vehicle. That image became important because it gave investigators something physical to compare against Chris's account. The case was no longer based solely on what one person said had happened. There was footage. There was a timeline. There were movements. There were objects. There were unanswered questions. And there was a family that could not be found. The pressure on Chris began to grow. Investigators examined the circumstances surrounding the disappearance. They learned about problems inside the marriage. They learned about Chris's relationship with Kessinger. They began to understand that the disappearance had occurred against a background of marital conflict. That did not prove murder. But it changed the context. A husband whose wife and children had disappeared was also a man who had been considering a life without them. The investigation moved closer. Chris was questioned. At first, he maintained his innocence. Then came the accusation against Shanann. It was an attempt to explain the deaths of the children, while shifting the first act of violence onto his wife. But the story did not hold. There were inconsistencies. There were questions about the physical evidence. There were questions about the timeline. And there was the increasingly difficult reality that Chris's own behavior was not matching the role of the grieving husband he had presented to the public. Eventually, he began to confess. The confession revealed that the story investigators had been hearing was not simply incomplete. It was constructed. Shanann had not murdered her daughters. Chris had killed Shanann. Chris had killed Bella. Chris had killed Celeste. And Shanann's pregnancy meant that another life had been lost. Nico would never be born. The finality of that realization changed the meaning of every earlier detail. The missed appointment was no longer an ordinary absence. The unanswered phone was no longer a temporary inconvenience. The car seats in the vehicle were no longer simply objects left behind. The house was no longer the scene of a mysterious disappearance. It was the last known home of 4 victims. On August 16, investigators went to the location connected to Chris's work. They searched the oil field site. And there, the disappearance ended. Sharnan was found in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were found inside the oil tanks. The investigators now had the physical evidence confirming what Chris had confessed. The family was dead. The search was over. But the investigation was only beginning to reveal the full scale of what had happened. The tragedy was no longer simply that a woman and her daughters had vanished. It was that the disappearance had been created by the person who was supposed to be closest to them. The person who stood before the cameras. The person who spoke about wanting them home. The person who knew exactly where they had been. And the person who knew where their bodies were hidden. That contradiction would become one of the defining images of the case. Chris Watts asking for his family to return while knowing they could never return. The public was seeing one story. Investigators were uncovering another. And between those two stories was a truth so devastating that it would permanently change the way people looked at the family photographs that had once appeared so ordinary. The Watts family had not been destroyed by a stranger breaking into their home. The danger had come from within the family itself. And that is what makes the final hours so difficult to understand. There was no unknown predator waiting somewhere outside. There was no random attack in a dark alley. There was a husband. A wife. 2 children. An unborn baby. A home. A marriage that was already breaking apart. And a man who believed that killing the people connected to his old life could somehow clear a path toward a new one. But a life cannot be rebuilt from 4 graves. A future cannot be made clean by destroying the past. And no matter what Chris Watts imagined he would gain, the result was permanent. Sharnan was gone. Bella was gone. Celeste was gone. Nico was gone. The house remained. The street remained. The world outside continued. Cars still passed through Frederick. People still went to work. The sun still rose over Colorado. But for the Watts family, time had stopped. The next chapter of the investigation would move away from the immediate horror of the crime and toward the physical evidence left behind. The house would be examined. The security footage would be studied. Chris's movements would be reconstructed. His statements would be compared with what investigators had discovered. Every contradiction would become important. Every unexplained detail would demand an answer. And slowly, the image of the desperate husband would disappear. In its place would emerge the reality of what had happened in the early hours of August 13, 2018. The disappearance had begun with silence. It would end with evidence. And between those 2 points lay the terrible story of how a family of 4, soon to be 5, was destroyed in a matter of hours. By the time police entered the Watts home, the house was still carrying the appearance of an ordinary family residence. That was what made the scene so unsettling. Nothing about the exterior announced what had happened inside. The neighborhood was quiet. The houses stood close together, separated by driveways, lawns, fences, and the familiar geometry of suburban life. Cars remained parked where they were supposed to be. Doors remained closed. Morning had arrived without knowing that something terrible had already happened. Inside the Watts residence, however, the normal rhythm of family life had been interrupted. Sharnan was gone. Bella was gone. Celeste was gone. And the woman who had been expected to attend a medical appointment that morning had simply disappeared. The first person who refused to accept that disappearance as ordinary was Nicole Atkinson. She had brought Sharnan home only hours earlier. She knew that Sharnan had returned to the house. She knew that the children were supposed to be there. And when Shanann failed to respond, Nicole did what someone does when concern begins to overpower rational explanations. She went to the house. The vehicle belonging to Shanann was still there. The children's car seats were still there. Those details mattered because they suggested that the family had not simply left together. If Shanann had decided to leave, why was her vehicle still at home? If the children had gone somewhere, why were their seats still there? If everything was normal, why had Shanann missed her appointment? Each detail by itself could have had an innocent explanation. Together, they formed something different. A pattern. Nicole attempted to enter the residence, but encountered an interior lock that prevented her from fully opening the door. She contacted authorities. The police response was initially based on uncertainty. They were not arriving at a known murder scene. They were responding to a welfare concern. A pregnant woman was missing. 2 small children were missing. A friend was worried. A husband was about to become the person who could explain where they were. Chris Watts arrived as investigators began looking into the situation. At first, there was no obvious reason for the officers to know that he was responsible. He was the husband. He was the father. He was the person who, on the surface, should have been searching for the same answers they were. But investigators are trained to pay attention, not only to what people say, but also to what surrounds those words. The house. The vehicles. The timeline. The physical objects. The behavior of the people present. The first stage of an investigation is often about separating what is known from what is assumed. The known facts were simple. Shanann had returned home around 1:48 in the morning. She was pregnant. She had 2 daughters. She had an appointment that morning. She did not appear. She did not respond to calls or messages. Her vehicle remained at the house. Her children were nowhere to be found. And Chris Watts said his wife and daughters were missing. Everything else was still a question. Investigators began looking through the residence. They were searching for signs of where Shanann and the children might have gone, but they were also searching for signs that they had not left voluntarily. The distinction was crucial. A missing person case can begin with the assumption that someone has simply gone somewhere. But the longer the investigators examined the circumstances, the less comfortable that explanation became. Then another source of information came into focus. A neighbor's security camera. Nathan Trinistick lived nearby, and his camera had captured activity around the Watts property. Security footage can be remarkably powerful in an investigation, because it does not rely on memory. People forget. People misremember. People change their stories. A camera simply records movement. It does not care who is telling the truth. It does not become nervous during an interview. It does not have a reason to protect anyone. The footage showed Chris Watts moving his vehicle from the garage that morning. He appeared to be loading items into it. That movement became significant. Investigators had a man whose wife and children were supposedly missing, yet surveillance footage showed him engaging in activity around his vehicle. It did not answer the central question. But it created another one. Where was Chris going? What was he carrying? Why was he leaving the house? And why did his behavior look different from what investigators might expect from a man whose family had just disappeared? The camera footage became one of the first pieces of evidence that could be used to reconstruct the morning. It created a visual timeline. Before the footage, investigators had statements. After the footage, they had statements that could be compared against what had actually been recorded. That difference would become increasingly important. Chris would eventually appear before television cameras. His family was missing. The public did not yet know what investigators were beginning to suspect. He presented himself as a concerned husband and father. His words asked for his wife and children to come home. To viewers, it was easy to see only the surface. A man standing outside his home. A family missing. A pregnant wife. 2 little girls. A father asking the public for help. But investigators were looking at the details beneath that image. The relationship between Chris and Sharnan had not been healthy for some time. There had been tension. There had been a separation in the emotional sense, even though they still shared a home. And Chris had begun seeing another woman. Nicole Kessinger. The discovery of that relationship changed the context of the case. An affair does not prove murder. Marital problems do not prove murder. A desire for divorce does not prove murder. But investigators were no longer looking at a disappearance occurring in a vacuum. There was a potential motive for Chris to want a different life. And there was evidence that he had already been imagining one. That raised a new and more disturbing possibility. What if the disappearance was not something Chris was trying to solve? What if it was something he had created? The investigators did not immediately have an answer. They had to build the case carefully. The house became a place where every detail mattered. The garage. The doors. The vehicles. The children's belongings. The absence of the people who should have been there. And the security footage outside. The investigation was beginning to move from the question of where the family had gone to the question of what had happened to them. That transition is one of the most important moments in any criminal investigation. A missing person can return. A family can be found. A misunderstanding can be resolved. But when evidence begins to suggest that someone may have been harmed, the entire nature of the investigation changes. The emotional atmosphere changes. The questions become more precise. The timeline becomes more important. And the people closest to the missing person become subjects of scrutiny. Chris was now at the center of that scrutiny. Yet he continued presenting himself as the husband searching for his family. The public appeal became one of the most recognizable images of the case. Chris stood before cameras and spoke about Sharnan. He spoke about his children. He wanted them home. But while the public was hearing those words, investigators were learning about another Chris Watts. The man who had been having an affair. The man who wanted to leave his marriage. The man who had begun imagining a future without Sharnan and the children. The gap between those two images became increasingly difficult to ignore. There was the Chris Watts seen by the public. And there was the Chris Watts revealed through the investigation. The difference between them would become the central mystery. Meanwhile, the search continued. The family had to be found. Investigators needed to determine whether Sharnan and the children were still alive. Every minute mattered. The absence of a medical appointment mattered. The unanswered phone mattered. The car mattered. The children's car seats mattered. The camera mattered. And Chris's behavior mattered. Individually, none of these pieces could explain the entire story. Together, they began forming a picture. The investigators also had to consider the possibility that the family had left the house for another reason. Perhaps Sharnan had gone somewhere. Perhaps the children had been taken somewhere. Perhaps there was another person involved. But as investigators learned more about Chris's private life, the possibility of an outside stranger became less convincing. The person closest to the missing family was standing directly in front of them. Chris knew the house. He knew Sharnan's routine. He knew the children. He knew the vehicles. He knew where they were supposed to be. And he knew what he was saying to investigators. That knowledge could be used to help find them. Or it could be used to conceal what had happened. The distinction would become critical. As the investigation intensified, Chris's story began to attract greater attention. His account of the morning would be examined. His movements would be examined. His relationship with Sharnan would be examined. His relationship with Kessinger would be examined. And investigators would begin asking questions that could not be answered with general statements about a missing family. They needed times. They needed locations. They needed actions. They needed to know what Chris had done after Sharnan came home. And they needed to know where he had gone that morning. The security footage offered part of the answer. But it did not show everything. There were blind spots. There were moments outside the camera's view. There were events that happened inside the house. And there were people who could not tell investigators what they had seen. Sharnan was gone. Bella was gone. Celeste was gone. Their voices were absent from the investigation. That meant the evidence had to speak for them. The house had to speak. The camera had to speak. The vehicles had to speak. The timeline had to speak. And eventually, Chris's own words would speak. But at this stage, the investigators did not yet know how much those words would change. They were still dealing with a man who appeared to want his family found. They were still trying to understand whether they were looking at a disappearance, an abduction, a family emergency, or something far worse. The most frightening possibility was beginning to emerge slowly. The family might not have disappeared at all. They might have been killed. And if that was true, the person who knew the most about what had happened could already be standing among them. That possibility changed the meaning of everything. The camera footage was no longer simply footage of a man leaving his garage. It was a record of movement that might help establish what happened to 3 missing people. The car was no longer simply a vehicle. It was part of a timeline. The children's seats were no longer ordinary objects. They were evidence that the children had not simply been taken on a normal trip. The house was no longer merely a place to search. It was potentially the last location where the family had been alive. And Chris Watts was no longer simply a worried husband. He was becoming the central person of interest in a case that had only hours earlier been described as a disappearance. The investigation was entering a different phase. The questions were becoming sharper. The explanations were becoming harder to accept. And the image Chris had presented to the public was beginning to fracture. Soon, investigators would confront him more directly. Soon, his story would begin to change. Soon, the words he had spoken about Sharnan and the girls would collide with the evidence. And once that happened, there would be almost nowhere left for the truth to hide. The house had given investigators the first questions. The camera had given them a timeline. The missing family had given them a reason to keep looking. Now they needed one thing above all else. An answer. Where were Sharnan, Bella, and Celeste? And what had happened to them after Sharnan walked through the door at 1:48 that morning? The investigation had begun with a friend asking police to check on a family. It was becoming something much darker. The search for missing people was turning into a search for victims. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Frederick, investigators were moving closer to the place where the final evidence would be found. By now, the investigation had reached a point where the question was no longer simply where Sharnan Watts and her daughters had gone. The question was becoming much more difficult. What had happened to them? In the first hours of a disappearance, investigators have to keep the possibilities open. A person can leave voluntarily. A child can be taken by someone they know. A family can become involved in an accident. A misunderstanding can look like a crime until another explanation emerges. But the Watts case was refusing to behave like an ordinary missing person investigation. The mother was pregnant. The children were only 3 and 4 years old. Sharnan had returned home in the early hours of the morning. She had an appointment later that day. She had not shown up. Her vehicle remained at the house. The children's car seats remained behind. And the husband was now telling investigators that his family had disappeared. Every new fact narrowed the possibilities. The first person investigators needed to understand was Chris Watts. He was the husband. He was the father. He was the last person known to have been inside the home with Sharnan and the girls. And he was also the person who seemed to know the least about what had happened, at least according to the story he initially presented. Chris told investigators that Sharnan and the children were gone. But investigators needed more than that. They needed to know what had happened inside the house. They needed to know when Sharnan had arrived. They needed to know when Chris had last seen her. They needed to know when he had last seen the girls. They needed to know what happened before he left for work. They needed to know why he had moved his truck. And they needed to know what he had been doing after his family supposedly disappeared. These were not emotional questions. They were timeline questions. And timelines are often where false stories begin to break apart. A person can prepare a general explanation. It is much harder to create a believable sequence of events that survives every detail. What time did something happen? Where was the person standing? What did they do next? What did they touch? What did they see? Where did they go? Who could confirm it? Each answer creates another question. And each contradiction creates another crack. As investigators examined the Watts family, they learned that the marriage had not been as stable as it appeared from the outside. Chris and Sharnan had been experiencing serious problems. Chris had become involved with another woman. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She worked with Chris, and their relationship had become significant enough that Chris was imagining a future with her. That information immediately changed the context surrounding the disappearance. It did not, by itself, establish that Chris had killed anyone. But it gave investigators something they could not ignore. A man whose wife and children had disappeared was also a man who had been considering a future without them. That meant the possibility of a stranger abducting the family was not the only theory. There was another possibility. What if the disappearance had been connected to the marriage itself? What if the family had not been taken by someone outside the home? What if the person responsible had been inside it? Investigators began looking at Chris more closely. His public behavior was one thing. His private life was another. In front of cameras, he appeared to be asking for help. Behind the scenes, investigators were learning that he had wanted the marriage to end. That contrast mattered. It created a psychological question that would follow the investigation. Was Chris really the desperate husband he appeared to be? Or was he performing the role of a desperate husband, because he needed the world to believe that his family had simply vanished? The security footage from the neighbor's camera added another layer. It showed Chris moving his truck out of the garage, and apparently loading items into it. Again, the footage did not tell investigators exactly what he was carrying. But it gave them something objective. They could see his movements. They could compare those movements with his statements. And the more they examined the morning, the more important the footage became. If Chris had nothing to hide, his explanation for those movements should have been straightforward. If he had something to hide, every detail would become a potential problem. Investigators also began speaking with people who knew the family. Friends, neighbors, people connected to Sharnan, people connected to Chris. They were trying to understand the family dynamic. They were trying to determine whether Sharnan had expressed fear, whether Chris had threatened her, whether anyone had noticed unusual behavior, whether the couple had been preparing to separate, and whether there was anything in the days before the disappearance that could explain what had happened. The investigation was not simply about finding a missing person anymore. It was about reconstructing a relationship. And relationships leave traces. Messages. Conversations. Arguments. Plans. Promises. Secrets. Chris's relationship with Kessinger became especially important. She had information about Chris that Sharnan did not appear to have. She knew that Chris was interested in her. She knew that he wanted a different future. And she knew that he was still married. The existence of that relationship created a motive investigators could examine. Chris did not simply have a troubled marriage. He had another relationship waiting on the other side of it. That does not make murder inevitable. But it creates a question that investigators cannot ignore. What happens when a person decides that the life they already have is standing in the way of the life they want? Most people face that kind of conflict without violence. They leave. They separate. They negotiate. They suffer. They rebuild. Chris had other options. But investigators were beginning to suspect that he had chosen something else. The pressure on him increased. He was interviewed. He was questioned about his family. He was asked about his marriage. He was asked about the mourning. He was asked about Sharnan. He was asked about the children. And eventually, the story he had been telling began to shift. At first, Chris maintained that he had not harmed his family. Then he introduced the explanation that would become one of the most disturbing parts of his confession. He said Sharnan had killed the girls. According to this version, Chris had confronted her about their marriage. He claimed that after he told her that the relationship was over, he saw her kill Bella and Celeste. He then claimed that he killed Sharnan in response. It was a story that moved the first act of violence away from Chris. It made Sharnan responsible for the deaths of her own children. It turned Chris into a husband reacting to an unimaginable event rather than the person who had created it. But investigators did not simply accept the story. They continued asking questions. The physical evidence did not support the idea that Sharnan had been responsible for the deaths of the children in the way Chris described. His story also raised obvious questions about his behavior afterward. If Sharnan had killed the girls, why had Chris transported all 3 bodies? Why had he taken them to the oil field site? Why had he concealed them? Why had he not immediately contacted emergency services? Why had he appeared before cameras asking the public to help find his family? Every question pushed against the story. And eventually, Chris changed it again. The first version collapsed. Sharnan had not killed Bella and Celeste. Chris had. The admission transformed the investigation. The police now had a confession that the father himself was responsible for the deaths of his family. But the confession created new questions rather than ending them. Why? What had happened in the house? What had happened to Sharnan? What had happened to the children? And what had Chris planned before he left for work? The investigation became a search for the physical evidence that could confirm his words. The oil field site became critical. Chris had directed investigators toward the location where he had taken the bodies. This was not simply another search area. It was the place where the missing family had been hidden. Investigators went there. The landscape was very different from the suburban world of Saratoga Trail. The Watts home represented domestic life. The oil field site represented work. Industrial equipment. Storage tanks. Open ground. A place where Chris knew how to move and where he believed the bodies could remain concealed. There, investigators found Shannan's remains in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were found inside oil tanks. The physical discovery confirmed the confession. The missing family was dead. There was no longer a question of whether Shannan would come home. There was no longer a question of whether Bella and Celeste had been taken somewhere. The investigation now had victims. It had a location. It had a suspect. And it had a confession. But the psychological mystery remained. Why would Chris Watts destroy the family he had built? The answer investigators began to construct was not a simple one. There was no single moment that could explain everything. There was the failing marriage. There was the affair. There was Chris's desire for another relationship. There was the pregnancy. There was the growing distance between the life he had and the life he imagined. And there was the possibility that he began to see his family not as people with rights and futures of their own, but as obstacles standing between him and the life he wanted. That distinction is important. Because a marriage can end. A relationship can end. People can leave each other. But children do not become obstacles simply because a parent wants a different life. Bella and Celeste were not responsible for the marriage. Nico was not responsible for the marriage. Shannan was not responsible for Chris's choices. Yet all four became victims of them. The investigation also revealed how much Chris's public behavior had contrasted with the reality. He had stood before cameras. He had asked for his family to return. He had spoken as though he was waiting for them. Meanwhile, the bodies were already hidden. That contradiction would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It suggested that Chris understood the power of appearances. If people believed the family had disappeared, then suspicion might move outward. Investigators might look for a stranger. The public might search neighborhoods. Friends might make phone calls. Television networks might broadcast photographs. And Chris could remain in the position of the grieving husband. But that strategy did not last. The surveillance footage, the investigation into the marriage, the affair, the inconsistencies in his story, and finally his own confession brought the truth closer. The image of the worried father could not survive the evidence. And once the investigators knew that Chris was responsible, they had to reconstruct the crime with greater precision. The question was no longer whether Chris had killed his family. The question was exactly how. That would become particularly important, because Chris's accounts were not consistent. He had already demonstrated that he was willing to alter the story. The first explanation blamed Shannan. The next explanation placed Chris in the role of a husband reacting to her alleged actions. The final version placed responsibility where the evidence indicated it belonged. With Chris. But even then, investigators had to consider the limits of his statements. A confession is powerful. It is not automatically the complete truth. A person who has lied can continue to lie even while confessing. They can minimize. They can shift blame. They can leave out details. They can create explanations that make their own actions appear less deliberate. That is why the evidence mattered so much. The house, the vehicle, the surveillance footage, the timeline, the relationship, the oil field site, the recovered bodies. All of these pieces had to fit together. And slowly, they did. The family had not simply vanished. Their disappearance had been staged. Chris had not been searching for victims. He had been searching for a way to explain their absence. The public appeal had not been the beginning of the tragedy. It had been part of the aftermath. The real story had already happened inside the house. And once investigators understood that, the entire case changed. The man standing in front of the cameras was no longer the center of a search for his missing family. He was the center of a homicide investigation. The investigation that had begun with uncertainty was now moving toward prosecution. Chris Watts had confessed. The bodies had been found. The evidence was accumulating. And the next question was no longer simply what happened. It was what would happen to the man responsible. But before the courtroom, before the sentence, investigators still had to understand the full sequence. They had to confront the contradictions. They had to examine the motive. They had to determine how much of Chris's final confession could be trusted. And they had to reconstruct the last hours of Sharnan, Bella, and Celeste as accurately as possible. Because the dead could not tell their own story. The investigators had to tell it for them. And every answer would bring them closer to a truth that was already becoming clear. This was not a random act. It was not the work of a stranger. It was a family destroyed from within. The man who wanted a new life had chosen the most irreversible way possible to end the old one. But the investigation was not finished. The next breakthrough would come when the pieces gathered from the house, the surveillance footage, Chris's relationships, his changing statements, and the oil field site would be brought together. Then the story would move from suspicion to certainty. And once that happened, there would be no version of events left that could make Chris Watts merely a missing family's grieving husband. He would have to face what he had done. And eventually, he would have to face the families of the people he had taken from the world. The investigation had reached the point where suspicion was no longer enough. For nearly 2 days, the Watts family had been missing. Sharnan Watts was gone. Bella was gone. Celeste was gone. And Chris Watts, the husband and father at the center of the investigation, had already given investigators a story that was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The first version had placed the blame on Sharnan. He had claimed that she killed their daughters. He had claimed that he reacted by killing her. But investigators were not satisfied. There were too many questions. Too many contradictions. Too many details that refused to fit together. And behind every question was the same terrible possibility. Chris Watts had not simply lost his family. He had destroyed it. The breakthrough would not come from one dramatic piece of evidence. It would come from several pieces finally connecting. The house. The surveillance footage. Chris's movements. His relationship with Nicole Kessinger. His changing statements. And eventually, the location where he had taken the bodies. By August 15, investigators were no longer treating the case as an ordinary disappearance. The atmosphere around the Watts home had changed. What had begun as a welfare check had become a major homicide investigation. The neighborhood that had seemed so ordinary only days earlier was now surrounded by investigators, vehicles, cameras, and people searching for answers. The public had seen Chris standing before television cameras. He had asked for his wife and daughters to come home. But investigators were now looking behind the words. They wanted facts. They wanted a timeline. They wanted to know what happened after Shanann returned home in the early morning hours of August 13th. And most importantly, they wanted to know why Chris's story kept changing. The pressure was becoming difficult to escape. When investigators questioned Chris again, his first explanation began to unravel. He had tried to place responsibility on Shanann. But that explanation required investigators to believe that a mother had suddenly killed her own daughters, and that Chris had then killed her in response. It also required investigators to accept that Chris, after discovering the deaths of his children, had not immediately called for help. Instead, he had transported the bodies away from the house. He had gone to his workplace. He had concealed them. And then he had returned to the outside world and behaved as though his family had simply disappeared. The story was becoming impossible to sustain. Eventually, Chris admitted that Shanann had not killed the children. He was responsible. That admission was the first major collapse. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of a deeper confession. The investigators now needed to know where the bodies were. Chris directed them toward the Anadarko petroleum oil field site where he worked. The location was crucial. It was far removed from the suburban appearance of Saratoga Trail. There were no family photographs there. No children's rooms. No familiar domestic objects. Instead, there were industrial structures and oil tanks. It was a place connected to Chris's professional life. A place he knew. A place where he had believed he could hide what he had done. Investigators moved toward the site. And what they found would transform the investigation forever. Shanann's body was located in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were found inside the oil tanks. The discovery confirmed the central truth of the case. The children had not disappeared. They had been killed. Shanann had not disappeared. She had been killed. And the location where their bodies were found was connected directly to Chris. The physical evidence now supported the confession. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to certainty. There was no longer a reasonable explanation in which Shanann and the girls were simply missing. They were dead. And Chris Watts knew where they had been hidden, because he had taken them there. But the discovery of the bodies also made another fact impossible to ignore. Shanann had been pregnant. Her unborn son was gone as well. Nico would never be born. The tragedy therefore involved more than the 3 people whose bodies had been recovered. There had been another life inside Shanann. A child who had already been named. A child who had already been expected. A child who had been part of the family's future. The breakthrough had now exposed the full scale of the crime. But investigators still had to understand the motive. Why would Chris do it? The answer appeared to be connected to the future he had been imagining. Chris had become involved with Nicole Kessinger. He wanted to move forward with her. He wanted the marriage to end. He wanted a different life. But the family he already had remained. Shanann remained his wife. Bella and Celeste remained his daughters. Nico remained the unborn child. Chris could not simply erase those relationships. Yet his actions suggested that he had begun to think of them as something standing between him and the future he wanted. That is where the psychological dimension of the case becomes particularly disturbing. There was no force requiring Chris to kill. There was no situation in which murder was his only escape. He had choices. He could have left. He could have filed for divorce. He could have moved out. He could have accepted the consequences of ending a marriage. He could have remained a father even if he was no longer a husband. Instead, he chose destruction. The investigators did not need to understand every thought in Chris's mind to establish responsibility. The evidence was already overwhelming. But understanding motive mattered, because it explained the context in which the crime occurred. The affair mattered. The deteriorating marriage mattered. The pregnancy mattered. Chris's desire for a new life mattered. His statements mattered. And his actions mattered most of all. The security footage from the neighbor's camera became even more significant after the bodies were found. Before the breakthrough, the footage had been suspicious. Now it became part of a much clearer timeline. Chris had moved his truck. He had loaded items. He had left the house. And the location where the bodies were found corresponded with his movements. The camera could not capture everything that happened inside the house. But it could show what happened afterward. That was enough to help investigators reconstruct the sequence. The physical world was now telling a story that was difficult to dispute. The truck had moved. The bodies had moved. Chris had moved. And the missing family had not left the way a normal family would have left. The pieces were connecting. At the same time, Chris's relationship with Kessinger became another important part of the investigation. She knew that Chris wanted a future with her. She knew he was still married. And investigators could compare what Chris had told her with what he told police. The difference between those conversations could reveal what he had been thinking before the murders. Again, the affair did not cause the murders. Chris made that decision. But the relationship helped investigators understand the future he was trying to create. A future without Sharnan. A future without the responsibilities of his existing family. A future that, in his mind, might have seemed simpler. But reality does not work that way. A family does not disappear because someone wants another relationship. Children do not become obstacles simply because an adult wants freedom. And a pregnant woman does not become disposable because a marriage is ending. The investigation was now exposing not only what Chris had done, but the distorted logic behind it. He had attempted to solve a human problem through irreversible violence. The result was not freedom. It was 4 deaths and a prison cell. The breakthrough also destroyed the public image Chris had constructed. The man who had stood before cameras asking for his family to come home could no longer be separated from the man who had hidden their bodies. The emotional performance of the missing husband could no longer survive the evidence. The public had been watching one story. Investigators had discovered another. And the difference between the 2 stories was enormous. The case now had a clear direction. Chris was no longer simply a person of interest. He was the person responsible. The evidence was converging. The bodies had been found. The confession had expanded. The timeline was becoming clearer. And the motive was beginning to emerge. But one final question remained. Would Chris continue fighting the evidence? Or would he admit what he had done? The answer came quickly. Instead of taking the case through a long trial, Chris Watts eventually pleaded guilty to the charges. On November 6, 2018, he admitted responsibility for the crimes. That decision removed one of the uncertainties that often surrounds a major homicide case. There would be no prolonged courtroom battle over whether he had killed his family. There would be no defense built around mistaken identity. There would be no argument that investigators had arrested the wrong man. The man responsible had admitted it. But a guilty plea could not undo what had happened. It could not bring Sharnan home. It could not return Bella and Celeste to their bedrooms. It could not give Nico his first breath. It could not erase the memory of the morning when a friend arrived at the Watts house and realized that something was terribly wrong. The breakthrough had solved the mystery of the disappearance. But it had not solved the grief. That was a different problem. No investigation can solve grief. No confession can repair a family. No sentence can turn back time. The physical search was over. The bodies had been recovered. The suspect had confessed. But for the families of Sharnan, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, the real aftermath was only beginning. They would have to live with the knowledge that the person responsible had been someone inside the family. Someone who had known the children personally. Someone who had held them. Someone who had lived with them. Someone who had once been called husband and father. That realization is difficult to comprehend, because families are built on trust. A child does not normally question whether a parent will protect them. A wife does not normally expect her husband to become the greatest danger inside her home. Trust creates a kind of psychological shelter. The Watts case destroyed that shelter. And perhaps that is why the case resonated so deeply with the public. People were not simply looking at a murder. They were looking at the collapse of an idea. The idea that a family home is automatically safe. The idea that a smiling family photograph reflects the truth behind the photograph. The idea that a person who looks ordinary must therefore be ordinary inside. Chris Watts had looked ordinary. He had worked. He had lived in a suburban neighborhood. He had raised children. He had stood beside his pregnant wife. He had appeared in family photographs. And yet, beneath that ordinary appearance, he had been making decisions that would end the lives of everyone closest to him. The breakthrough revealed the truth. But it also revealed something darker. The crime had not been solved by discovering a mysterious stranger. It had been solved by looking closely at the people already inside the story. The husband. The father. The man who knew where the bodies were. The man whose story changed when investigators pushed harder. The man whose movements were captured on camera. The man whose private relationship revealed a desire for another life. The man who eventually confessed. The evidence had become a chain. Each piece connected to another. The missing appointment led to concern. The concern led to the house. The house led to questions. The questions led to surveillance footage. The footage led to inconsistencies. The inconsistencies led to deeper questioning. The questioning led to confession. The confession led to the oil field site. And the site led to the bodies. The chain was complete. There was nowhere left for the disappearance to hide. Sharnan Watts had not walked away. Bella Watts had not wandered away. Celeste Watts had not been abducted by a stranger. They had been killed by the person who was supposed to be part of their protection. And Nico, who had never had the chance to see the world, had been lost with his mother. The breakthrough was therefore not simply the moment investigators found the bodies. It was the moment the story could no longer be disguised. The family was dead. Chris Watts was responsible. And the legal system would now have to determine the punishment. The next stage would move from the investigation room to the courtroom. There would be no mystery about who had committed the crime. Instead, the questions would become different. What punishment could possibly reflect the destruction of 4 lives? What would the victims' families say? What would Chris Watts say when he no longer had cameras between himself and the people affected by his actions? And when the final sentence was delivered, would justice feel like justice to the people left behind? The investigation had found the truth. Now the truth would have to face the law.